In 1843, the small township of Millfield, nestled in the rolling hills of southern Virginia's Albemarle County, was known for three things: its tobacco plantations, its morning mist that clung to the James River, and the unusual silence that seemed to blanket the entire region. The silence was not the peaceful quiet of rural life, but something heavier, more deliberate. It was the kind of silence that suggested secrets were being carefully maintained. The Whitmore plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of fertile land, bordered by dense woodland to the north and the meandering river to the south. The main house, a two-story structure built in 1798, stood like a sentinel overlooking the fields, where rows of tobacco plants swayed in the humid summer breeze. Behind the main house, a collection of smaller buildings housed the enslaved population that worked the land. Among these individuals was a young woman known only as Celia, though records suggest this may not have been her birth name. According to the plantation ledger maintained by overseer Thomas Garrett, Celia was approximately 22 years of age in 1843. She had arrived at the Whitmore plantation 3 years prior, purchased from an estate sale in Richmond. The ledger describes her as uncommonly handsome and notes that she possessed what Garrett termed an unsettling intelligence. The Whitmore family consisted of plantation owner Edmund Whitmore, his wife Margaret, and their 3 adult children, sons Edmund Jr. and Charles, and daughter Victoria. Edmund Jr., 28 years old, had recently returned from his studies in Charleston and was being groomed to eventually take over the plantation operations. Charles, 25, spent most of his time traveling between Richmond and Norfolk on business matters. Victoria, 23, was considered the belle of the county and was expected to marry well within the year. On the morning of July 15th, 1843, something occurred that would forever alter the delicate balance of life at the Whitmore plantation. The exact details of what transpired remain unclear, as official records from that period are notably sparse. However, piecing together fragments from various sources, a disturbing picture begins to emerge. According to a diary entry discovered years later in the attic of the main house, Victoria Whitmore wrote, "Father summoned Celia to his study this morning. She emerged nearly 2 hours later, her usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. When I inquired about the nature of their meeting, Father merely stated that certain disciplinary measures were to be implemented forthwith." The diary entry, written in Victoria's distinctive handwriting, continues, "I observed Celia throughout the remainder of the day. She moved about her duties with mechanical precision, but there was something in her eyes that I had never seen before. It was not fear exactly, but rather a kind of calculating awareness that made me deeply uneasy." What Edmund Whitmore had discussed with Celia in his study that July morning remains unknown. However, subsequent events suggest that some form of punishment had been decreed, likely to be carried out publicly, as was customary on the plantation. Such punishments were typically administered on Saturday mornings, when the entire enslaved population was gathered in the courtyard behind the main house. The plantation routine continued as normal for the remainder of the week. Celia resumed her duties in the main house, which included cleaning, food preparation, and tending to the personal needs of the Whitmore women. Other enslaved individuals on the plantation later reported that Celia's behavior during this period was notably subdued, but not in the manner one might expect from someone anticipating punishment. Old Samuel, who worked in the stables and had lived on the plantation for over 30 years, would later tell his grandson that Celia seemed to be studying everything and everybody during those final days of the week. She asked unusual questions about the layout of the plantation, the schedules of the overseers, and the habits of the Whitmore family. Samuel initially attributed this curiosity to nervousness about her impending punishment, but he would later revise this assessment. On Friday evening, July 21st, Celia approached Victoria Whitmore as the young woman was preparing for bed. According to Victoria's diary, Celia made an unusual request. She asked permission to spend the night in prayer in the small chapel that stood at the edge of the plantation grounds. The chapel, built in 1821, was rarely used except for occasional Sunday services conducted by a travelling minister. Victoria, perhaps moved by what she perceived as religious contrition, granted the request. She even provided Celia with a small oil lamp and a worn Bible. Victoria's diary entry from that evening notes, "I cannot explain why, but granting Celia's request filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. I found myself unable to sleep, listening for sounds from the direction of the chapel until well past midnight." The chapel where Celia spent that Friday night was a modest wooden structure, approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with a simple altar at the front and rough-hewn pews that could accommodate perhaps 40 people. The building had been constructed by the enslaved population under the direction of Edmund Whitmore's father, and over the years it had fallen into a state of disrepair. The floorboards creaked with age, and on windy nights the entire structure seemed to sway slightly. What Celia actually did during those long hours in the chapel would remain a mystery for many years. However, evidence discovered much later suggests that her activities that night were far more complex than simple prayer and meditation. She appears to have used the time to carefully examine every aspect of the building's construction, paying particular attention to areas that were not visible during daylight hours. Saturday morning, July 22nd, dawned grey and oppressive. The usual summer heat was accompanied by an unusual stillness in the air, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The enslaved population began gathering in the courtyard behind the main house at precisely 8 o'clock, as was customary for weekend disciplinary proceedings. Edmund Whitmore emerged from the main house dressed in his finest clothes, a practice he maintained whenever conducting official plantation business. He was accompanied by overseer Thomas Garrett and his 2 sons, Edmund Jr. and Charles. Victoria chose to remain inside, though she positioned herself at an upstairs window where she could observe the proceedings. The assembled crowd waited in silence as Edmund Whitmore took his position on the small raised platform that served for such occasions. Thomas Garrett stood to his right, holding a leather whip that had been crafted specifically for plantation discipline. The implement was approximately 4 feet in length, with a handle wrapped in cord and multiple leather strands that could inflict significant pain without causing permanent physical damage. At precisely 8:30, Edmund Whitmore called for Celia to step forward. The crowd turned expectantly toward the main house, waiting for her to emerge. Minutes passed. Edmund Whitmore called her name again, his voice carrying a note of irritation. Still, she did not appear. Thomas Garrett was dispatched to locate Celia and bring her to the courtyard. He searched the main house thoroughly, checking every room, closet, and storage area. She was nowhere to be found. Garrett then expanded his search to include the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the laundry, and even the slave quarters. Celia had seemingly vanished without a trace. The search continued for several hours, with virtually every person on the plantation participating. They combed through the tobacco fields, searched the dense woodland that bordered the property, and even dragged the shallow areas of the nearby creek. No sign of Celia was discovered. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. By noon, Edmund Whitmore was forced to dismiss the assembled crowd and postpone the disciplinary proceeding indefinitely. His frustration was evident to all present, though he maintained the composure expected of a plantation owner. However, Victoria's diary entry from that day reveals that her father was deeply disturbed by the turn of events. "Father paced his study for hours after dismissing the gathering," Victoria wrote. "When I brought him his afternoon tea, I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed plantation records. He muttered something about setting a precedent and how discipline must be maintained at all costs. I had never seen him so agitated. The initial assumption was that Celia had somehow managed to escape during the night, possibly with assistance from other enslaved individuals, or perhaps sympathetic individuals from outside the plantation. Edmund Whitmore immediately contacted the county sheriff and placed advertisements in Richmond newspapers offering a substantial reward for her capture and return. However, as days passed without any credible sightings or leads, a different theory began to emerge among the enslaved population. Old Samuel, who had worked on the plantation longer than anyone else, suggested that Celia had not fled at all. He believed she was still somewhere on the property, hidden in a location that the searchers had not yet discovered. This theory gained credence when several individuals reported hearing what sounded like soft singing emanating from the direction of the chapel during the late evening hours. The singing was described as barely audible, almost more of a humming than actual words, but it seemed to drift across the plantation grounds on the still night air. Thomas Garrett investigated these reports personally, conducting thorough searches of the chapel and its immediate surroundings. However, he found nothing out of the ordinary. The building remained exactly as it had been when Celia had requested permission to spend Friday night in prayer. The oil lamp had been properly extinguished, the Bible returned to its place on the altar, and even the dust on the floor showed only the normal patterns of foot traffic. Yet the reports of nighttime singing continued, becoming more frequent and more detailed as the weeks passed. Some claimed to hear not just humming, but actual words, though they could never quite make out the lyrics. Others reported seeing a faint light moving through the chapel windows during the darkest hours of the night, despite the building being securely locked each evening. Edmund Whitmore initially dismissed these reports as imagination fueled by superstition. However, as the stories persisted and began to affect the productivity and morale of the plantation workers, he decided to investigate personally. On the night of August 15th, nearly a month after Celia's disappearance, he positioned himself in the shadows near the chapel and waited. According to a letter he wrote to his brother in Richmond, Edmund Whitmore did indeed hear what he described as a low melodious sound coming from within the chapel sometime after midnight. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes before fading into silence. When he unlocked the chapel door and searched the interior with a lantern, he found nothing unusual. The letter, discovered among Edmund Whitmore's personal papers after his death, reveals his growing frustration and bewilderment. "I am a rational man," he wrote, "yet I cannot explain what I experienced that night. The sound was unmistakably human, yet there was no human presence to be found. I begin to wonder if the stress of recent events has affected my judgment more than I care to admit." As summer turned to autumn, life on the Whitmore plantation gradually returned to its normal routine. The tobacco harvest proceeded as scheduled, and the various duties and responsibilities were redistributed among the remaining enslaved population. However, an undercurrent of unease continued to permeate the atmosphere. Victoria Whitmore's diary entries from this period reveal a household struggling to maintain its equilibrium. "Mother has taken to keeping her bedroom door locked at night," she wrote in September. "She claims it is merely a precaution, but I suspect she is more disturbed by recent events than she cares to admit." Father continues to maintain his usual stern demeanor, but I have noticed him pausing frequently during conversations, as if listening for something that the rest of us cannot hear. The mystery of Celia's disappearance might have remained forever unsolved, had it not been for a discovery made in the spring of 1844. During routine maintenance work on the chapel, a carpenter named Jacob Morrison noticed that several floorboards near the altar seemed to have been disturbed recently. When he pried up the boards to investigate, He discovered a cavity beneath the chapel floor that appeared to have been artificially enlarged. The space was approximately 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. It was lined with rough wooden planks and contained several interesting items, a collection of dried fruits and preserved meats that could have sustained a person for several weeks, a small container of water, several candles, and most surprisingly, a detailed journal written in an elegant feminine hand. The journal belonged to Celia. Its pages revealed the careful planning that had gone into her disappearance, and the true nature of what she had been doing during those weeks when the plantation residents believed she had fled. She had not escaped at all, but had instead created an elaborate hiding place beneath the chapel floor and had been living there in secret. The journal entries detail the physical challenges of her concealment, the careful rationing of her limited supplies, and the psychological strain of remaining hidden for so long. However, they also reveal something else. Celia had been using her concealed position to observe and record the activities of the Whitmore family and plantation overseers. From her hiding place, she could hear conversations that took place in and around the chapel. She could also slip out during the darkest hours of the night to observe activities throughout the plantation. The journal contains detailed accounts of private conversations between Edmund Whitmore and his sons, descriptions of business dealings that were conducted in secret, and even intimate details about the personal lives of the Whitmore family members. Perhaps most significantly, the journal reveals that Celia had discovered evidence of illegal activities being conducted on the plantation. Edmund Whitmore was apparently involved in smuggling operations that violated federal regulations governing the interstate transport of enslaved individuals. He was also maintaining falsified records that concealed the true number of people held in bondage on his property. The journal entries suggest that Celia intended to use this information as leverage to secure her freedom, and possibly the freedom of others. However, her plan required her to remain hidden long enough to gather sufficient evidence to make her case compelling. The foolish trick that had saved her from punishment was actually a carefully orchestrated intelligence-gathering operation. Unfortunately, Celia's elaborate plan ultimately proved unsuccessful. The journal's final entry, dated March 28, 1844, indicates that she had been discovered by Thomas Garrett while attempting to retrieve additional supplies from the main house. The entry, written in an obviously hurried hand, states, "He knows, must attempt to reach the river before dawn. If this journal is found, and I am not, know that the truth lies in the locked chest in Edmund's study." No further trace of Celia was ever found. Thomas Garrett reported that he had pursued her through the woods toward the James River, but had lost her trail in the darkness. Whether she successfully escaped, drowned in the river, or met some other fate remains unknown. The locked chest mentioned in her journal was never located, and if it ever existed, its contents remained hidden. The discovery of Celia's hiding place and journal created a significant scandal within Albemarle County. Edmund Whitmore faced an investigation by federal authorities regarding the allegations contained in the journal, though no formal charges were ever filed. The investigation was quietly dropped after several months, and the Whitmore family continued to operate their plantation as before. However, the psychological impact of these events on the family was profound. Victoria Whitmore's diary entries from the summer of 1844 reveal a household that never fully recovered from the revelation that they had been under observation for months without knowing it. "I find myself examining every shadow, every sound, wondering what else we have failed to notice," she wrote in July. "The thought that someone was watching us, recording our most private moments, has shattered my sense of security in my own home." Edmund Whitmore died suddenly in 1846 at the age of 57. His death was attributed to a weak heart. though those who knew him well reported that he had never fully recovered from the stress of the events surrounding Celia's disappearance. His sons sold the plantation in 1848 and moved to Richmond, citing their desire to pursue other business opportunities. The chapel where Celia had hidden was torn down in 1849. The new owners of the property, the Harrison family, stated that the building was structurally unsound and posed a safety hazard. However, local residents suspected that the true reason for its demolition was the unsettling memories associated with it. Years later, during the chaos of the Civil War, several former enslaved individuals from the Whitmore plantation came forward with additional information about Celia and the events of 1843. According to their accounts, Celia had been planning her elaborate deception for months before putting it into action. She had recruited a network of allies among the enslaved population who had helped her gather supplies and create her hiding place. These individuals also revealed that Celia's real name was Sarah Thompson, and that she had been born free in Philadelphia before being kidnapped and sold into slavery at the age of 16. Her literacy and intelligence, which had so impressed and unsettled the Whitmore family, were the result of a formal education she had received before her enslavement. Her ultimate goal had not simply been to escape, but to expose the illegal activities at the Whitmore plantation and secure legal redress for herself and others. The question of whether Sarah, known as Celia, ultimately achieved her goals remains unanswered. No records exist of her successfully reaching freedom, but neither is there definitive proof of her capture or death. Some historians who have studied the case believe that she may have successfully escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad, while others argue that the challenges of her situation made survival unlikely. What is certain is that her foolish trick of hiding beneath the chapel floor accomplished something that a more conventional escape attempt might not have achieved. It exposed the vulnerability of the plantation system to determined resistance from within, and it demonstrated that even the most carefully controlled environment could be penetrated and observed by those with sufficient motivation and ingenuity. The story of Celia's disappearance became part of local folklore in Albemarle County, though the details were often distorted in the retelling. Some versions of the story transformed her into a supernatural figure who continued to haunt the plantation grounds long after her disappearance. Others portrayed her as a tragic figure who was ultimately defeated by the system she had attempted to challenge. However, the historical record suggests a different interpretation. Rather than being either a supernatural presence or a tragic victim, Celia appears to have been a remarkably resourceful individual who used intelligence and careful planning to turn her apparent powerlessness into a position of strength. Her ability to remain hidden while gathering damaging information about her oppressors represented a form of resistance that was both sophisticated and potentially devastating to the plantation system. The psychological impact of her actions extended far beyond the Whitmore plantation. Word of her disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her hiding place spread throughout the slave-holding regions of Virginia. The idea that an enslaved person could successfully remain hidden while observing and recording the activities of their oppressors created a sense of unease among plantation owners throughout the region. In the years following the incident, several other plantation owners reported similar mysterious disappearances, though none were ever conclusively linked to the Whitmore case. It is possible that Celia's example inspired others to attempt similar acts of resistance, though the lack of detailed records from this period makes it impossible to verify such connections. The Whitmore plantation records, which might have provided additional insight into these events, were largely destroyed during the Civil War. The plantation house itself was burned in 1863 during a Union raid, and most of the family's personal papers were lost with it. Victoria Whitmore's diary, which survived because she had taken it with her when she married and moved to Richmond, remains one of the few contemporary accounts of these events. Modern historians who have studied the case have noted its significance as an early example of intelligence gathering and psychological warfare conducted by enslaved individuals against their oppressors. The level of planning and execution demonstrated by Celia's actions suggests that resistance to slavery took many forms beyond the more obvious examples of physical rebellion and escape attempts. The case also highlights the vulnerability of the plantation system to disruption from within. The fact that a single individual could successfully observe and record activities on a large plantation for months without detection suggests that the surveillance and control mechanisms that supported slavery were less effective than their operators believed. In 1867, more than 20 years after Celia's disappearance, a traveller passing through the area wrote in his journal about visiting the site of the former Whitmore plantation. He noted that local residents still spoke in hushed tones about the events that had taken place there, and that many believed the area to be somehow cursed or haunted. The traveller, whose identity remains unknown, but whose journal was discovered in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, described the ruins of the chapel foundation as still being visible among the overgrown vegetation. He wrote, "Local children dare each other to approach the site after dark, though none are brave enough to actually do so. The adults speak of strange sounds and unexplained lights, though whether these phenomena are real or imagined is impossible to determine. Whether such reports had any basis in reality or were simply the product of local superstition, they demonstrate the lasting impact that Celia's actions had on the community. The idea that someone could successfully challenge the established order through intelligence and deception rather than open rebellion had fundamentally altered local perceptions of power and control. The mystery of what ultimately happened to Celia may never be solved. The historical record contains no definitive evidence of her fate after her final journal entry in March of 1844. However, her story serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression took many forms, some of which were far more sophisticated and psychologically complex than conventional historical narratives suggest. The foolish trick that saved her from punishment was anything but foolish. It was, instead, a carefully calculated act of resistance that exposed the vulnerabilities of a supposedly secure system and demonstrated that even those with the least apparent power could find ways to challenge and disrupt the structures that oppressed them. Perhaps most significantly, Celia's story illustrates the power of intelligence and careful observation as tools of resistance. Her ability to remain hidden while gathering information about illegal activities on the plantation suggests that she understood instinctively what modern intelligence professionals recognize as fundamental principles of espionage and surveillance. The fact that her plan ultimately saved her from the punishment that had been decreed demonstrates the effectiveness of her approach. By disappearing at the crucial moment, she not only avoided immediate harm, but also created a situation that worked to her advantage. The confusion and uncertainty that her disappearance created among the plantation's power structure gave her the time and opportunity she needed to gather the information that might ultimately have secured her freedom. Whether she successfully used that information to achieve her goals remains unknown, but the very fact that she was able to gather it represents a significant victory against a system designed to prevent exactly such activities. Her story stands as a testament to the power of human intelligence and determination to find ways to resist even the most oppressive circumstances. The small chapel where she spent her final night of apparent freedom, and where she subsequently hid for months while observing her oppressors, was never replaced after its demolition. The site remained empty, serving as an unintentional monument to her ingenuity and courage. Local residents continued to avoid the area long after the physical structures had been removed, as if the memory of her presence continued to exert some form of influence over the landscape. In the decades that followed, the story of the beautiful slave who used a foolish trick to avoid punishment became part of the oral tradition of the region, though the details were often altered in the retelling. Some versions emphasized supernatural elements, while others focused on the tragic aspects of her ultimate fate. However, the historical evidence suggests that the most remarkable aspect of her story was neither supernatural nor ultimately tragic, but rather the demonstration of how intelligence and determination could triumph over apparently insurmountable obstacles. The silence that had once blanketed the Whitmore plantation and the surrounding countryside was eventually broken by the chaos of the Civil War and the transformation of society that followed. However, those who remembered the events of 1843 understood that the silence had been broken much earlier by one young woman who refused to accept her assigned role in an unjust system and found a way to turn apparent powerlessness into a position of strength and influence. The sound that still echoes from those distant events is not the supernatural singing reported by frightened plantation workers, but rather the voice of human dignity asserting itself against oppression through intelligence, courage, and an unwillingness to submit to injustice without a fight. It is a voice that continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most effective challenges to unjust authority come not from open rebellion, but from the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to remain silent in the face of oppression. In 1858, 14 years after Celia's disappearance, a Methodist minister named Reverend William Hayes arrived in Albemarle County to establish a new congregation. Hayes, who had previously served in Pennsylvania and had strong abolitionist sympathies, began collecting oral histories from former enslaved individuals in the region. Among the stories he documented was a detailed account of the Whitmore plantation incident, provided by Samuel Williams, the elderly man who had worked in the plantation stables. According to Reverend Hayes's carefully preserved notes, Samuel revealed details about Celia's plan that had never been previously recorded. Samuel claimed that Celia had approached him several weeks before her disappearance, asking detailed questions about the construction of various buildings on the plantation. She had been particularly interested in the chapel, inquiring about when it had been built, who had supervised the construction, and whether any modifications had been made over the years. Samuel's account, as recorded by Reverend Hayes, suggests that Celia had been planning her concealment for much longer than previously believed. She had apparently spent months studying the daily routines of every person on the plantation, noting when different areas were occupied and when they were left unattended. She had even observed the patterns of wildlife in the area, learning when birds would sing and when they would be silent, information that would later help her move undetected during her nighttime activities. Perhaps most significantly, Samuel revealed that Celia had not acted entirely alone. According to his testimony, she had recruited a small network of trusted individuals who provided assistance at crucial moments. These allies had helped her excavate and prepare the hiding space beneath the chapel floor, supplied her with food and other necessities, and even created false evidence of her escape toward the river to mislead the search efforts. The network apparently included Rebecca, a woman who worked in the main house kitchen, and Moses, a field hand who had demonstrated his reliability during previous incidents involving runaway attempts by other enslaved individuals. Samuel himself had served as a lookout, warning the group when plantation overseers were approaching areas where they were working on preparations for Celia's concealment. This revelation significantly alters the traditional interpretation of Celia's story. Rather than being the isolated act of a single desperate individual, her foolish trick appears to have been part of a coordinated resistance effort involving multiple participants. The level of organization and planning required to execute such a complex operation suggests that organized resistance to slavery was more sophisticated and widespread than historical records typically indicate. Reverend Hayes's notes also contain information about what happened to other members of this resistance network after Celia's disappearance. Rebecca continued to work in the main house for several more years, but was eventually sold to a plantation in South Carolina after Thomas Garrett became suspicious of her activities. Moses disappeared one night in 1845, and unlike Celia's case, no extensive search was conducted for him. Samuel remained on the plantation until the Civil War, maintaining his silence about these events for more than a decade. The Reverend's documentation efforts were cut short in 1859 when he was transferred to a new assignment in Ohio. However, his notes were preserved in the archives of the Methodist Conference and were not rediscovered until the 1930s. When a graduate student researching antebellum religious activities in Virginia came across them while examining church records. By the time these documents were found, most of the individuals mentioned in the accounts were long dead, making it impossible to verify many of the details through additional interviews. However, the information they contained provided new insight into the sophisticated nature of resistance networks that operated within the slave system. The graduate student, Helen Morrison, used Reverend Hayes's notes as the foundation for her doctoral dissertation, which was completed in 1936 but never published due to the outbreak of World War II and subsequent disruptions in academic publishing. Morrison's research files, including transcripts of the original Hayes documents, were donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1962, where they remained largely unexamined for several more years. It was not until 1967 that historian Dr. James Patterson began a comprehensive study of resistance activities in antebellum Virginia plantations. Patterson's research, conducted as part of a broader project examining the social dynamics of slavery in the Upper South, brought renewed attention to the Celia case and the broader network of resistance activities that Reverend Hayes had documented. Patterson's analysis, published in a limited academic circulation in 1968, argued that the Whitmore Plantation incident represented a previously unrecognized form of resistance that combined elements of escape, espionage, and psychological warfare. He suggested that such activities may have been far more common than previously believed, but that their covert nature made them largely invisible to contemporary observers and subsequent historians. The 1968 publication of Patterson's findings coincided with the broader civil rights movement and sparked renewed interest in stories of resistance to slavery that went beyond the traditional narratives of armed rebellion and escape attempts. However, the limited circulation of academic publications meant that knowledge of Celia's story remained confined to a small circle of specialized researchers. Meanwhile, in Albemarle County itself, local memory of the events had largely faded. The site of the former Whitmore plantation had been developed into a small residential community in the 1920s, and few of the new residents were aware of the property's history. The old cemetery, where members of the Whitmore family had been buried, was maintained by a local historical society, but the graves themselves bore no mention of the events that had disrupted their lives in the 1840s. The chapel site, which had remained empty since the building's demolition in 1849, had gradually been reclaimed by forest growth. By the 1960s, only careful examination could reveal the slight depression in the earth that marked where the foundation had once stood. Local children occasionally played in the area, but none were aware of the dramatic events that had once unfolded there. In 1968, the same year that Dr. Patterson published his analysis, a construction crew working on a new subdivision discovered several artifacts buried near the old chapel site. The items included fragments of leather that appeared to be from a binding, several pieces of metal that may have been parts of a lock mechanism, and most intriguingly, a small collection of papers wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved in a metal container. The papers contained what appeared to be additional pages from Celia's journal, pages that had not been included in the original discovery in 1844. These fragments provided new details about her activities during the month she spent in hiding, including descriptions of conversations she had overheard and observations about the illegal activities being conducted on the plantation. One particularly significant entry, dated February 15, 1844, described a nighttime meeting between Edmund Whitmore and several men whom Celia did not recognize. According to her account, the men arrived after midnight and conducted their business in whispered conversations near the chapel. She was able to observe their activities through a small gap she had created in the chapel floor, and she recorded details about the exchange of money and documents that suggested involvement in slave trading operations that violated federal regulations. The discovery of these additional journal pages created considerable excitement among historians studying slavery and resistance activities. However, questions about their authenticity arose almost immediately. The metal container in which they were found appeared to be of relatively recent manufacture, and the preservation of the papers seemed unusually good for materials that had supposedly been buried for more than a century. Dr. Patterson, who was contacted to examine the newly discovered materials, expressed skepticism about their authenticity. In a letter to a colleague, he noted that the handwriting, while similar to that in the original journal, showed subtle differences that suggested the possibility of forgery. He also pointed out that the metal container showed no signs of the corrosion that would be expected from more than a century of burial in Virginia soil. Further investigation revealed that the construction site where the papers were found had been disturbed several times in recent years by amateur treasure hunters who believed that valuable items might be buried in the area. The possibility that someone had planted the documents as part of an elaborate hoax could not be ruled out. The controversy surrounding the authenticity of the newly discovered journal pages ultimately overshadowed their historical value. Academic interest in the case began to wane as researchers focused their attention on other projects with clearer documentation. By the early 1970s, the story of Celia and her foolish trick had once again faded into historical obscurity. However, the fundamental questions raised by her case remained unresolved. Whether the newly discovered journal pages were authentic or not, the original documentation of her activities was sufficient to establish that sophisticated resistance networks had operated within the slave system. The level of planning and coordination required for her concealment operation demonstrated that enslaved individuals possessed far more agency and organizational capability than traditional historical narratives suggested. The psychological impact of her actions on the plantation power structure also remained significant, regardless of questions about specific details. The fact that plantation owners throughout Virginia reportedly increased security measures following news of the Whitmore incident indicates that the case was perceived as representing a genuine threat to the stability of the slave system. In 1976, during the bicentennial commemoration of American independence, local historical societies throughout Virginia began renewed efforts to document stories of resistance and struggle from the colonial and antebellum periods. the Albemarle County Historical Society commissioned a research project to investigate local traditions and oral histories that might have been overlooked by previous historians. The project, led by local historian Margaret Collins, resulted in the collection of numerous stories and legends that had been passed down through families in the area. Among these accounts were several versions of the Celia story, each with different details, but all sharing common elements. A beautiful and intelligent enslaved woman, a planned punishment that never took place, a mysterious disappearance, and subsequent strange occurrences at the plantation. Collins noted that the various versions of the story had evolved over time, with some incorporating supernatural elements and others focusing on more practical aspects of escape and resistance. However, the persistence of the basic narrative across multiple family traditions suggested that the core events had indeed occurred and had made a lasting impression on local communities. The Bicentennial Research Project also uncovered references to similar incidents at other plantations in Virginia during the same time period. While none of these cases were as well documented as the Whitmore incident, they suggested that Celia's foolish trick may have inspired copycat attempts elsewhere. The pattern of mysterious disappearances, followed by reports of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, appeared at several other locations throughout the 1840s and 1850s. These findings contributed to a growing recognition among historians that resistance to slavery had taken many forms beyond the dramatic rebellions and escape attempts that dominated traditional historical narratives. The Celia case represented what scholars began to term invisible resistance, activities that were designed to disrupt the slave system without openly challenging it in ways that would provoke immediate and violent retaliation. As the 20th century drew to a close, interest in such stories of invisible resistance continued to grow among both academic historians and the general public. The story of Celia's foolish trick began to appear in popular histories and educational materials, though often in simplified versions that emphasized dramatic elements over the more complex questions of organization, planning, and psychological warfare that her case actually represented. In 1998, the site of the former Whitmore plantation was designated as a point of interest by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. A small historical marker was installed near the entrance to the residential subdivision that now occupied the property. The marker provided a brief summary of the plantation's history and mentioned the unexplained disappearance of an enslaved woman in 1843. But did not include details about the sophisticated nature of her resistance activities. The chapel site itself remained undeveloped and was eventually donated to the county as a small park. Local gardening enthusiasts planted native wildflowers and maintained walking trails through the area, but few visitors were aware of the dramatic events that had once unfolded there. The slight depression in the earth where the chapel foundation had stood was still visible to those who knew what to look for, but it appeared to casual observers as merely a natural feature of the landscape. Today, more than a century and a half after Celia's disappearance, her story continues to raise important questions about the nature of resistance, the complexity of human behavior under oppressive circumstances, and the ways in which individual acts of courage can challenge seemingly insurmountable systems of power and control. The foolish trick that saved her from punishment was revealed to be anything but foolish. Instead, it represented a sophisticated understanding of psychology, logistics, and strategic planning that allowed her to turn apparent weakness into strength and to transform the very system designed to control her into a source of information and potential leverage. Whether she ultimately achieved her goals of freedom and justice may never be known. However, her story serves as a reminder that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most effective challenges to unjust authority come not from open confrontation, but from the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to accept their assigned roles in systems of oppression. The sound that once drifted across the plantation grounds on still summer evenings, whether real or imagined, supernatural or entirely human, has long since faded into silence. But the echo of her courage and intelligence continues to resonate, reminding us that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity finds ways to assert itself, and that the most powerful resistance often comes from those who appear to have no power at all. In the end, Celia's legacy lies not in any supernatural phenomena or mysterious disappearances, but in the demonstration that careful planning, intelligent observation, and unwavering determination can create possibilities for resistance even within the most carefully controlled and oppressive environments. Her foolish trick stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit to find ways to challenge injustice, no matter how impossible the odds may appear. The silence that once blanketed the Whitmore plantation has been replaced by the ordinary sounds of modern suburban life. Children play in yards where tobacco once grew, and families gather for dinner in homes built on land where suffering and resistance once intertwined in complex and tragic ways. But for those who know the history, the echo of Celia's courage continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that freedom is not given, but taken, and that sometimes the most profound victories come from battles that are fought in silence and shadow.